They will tell you that Salem's madness ended in 1692, that the trials burned out, the hysteria vanished, and the town, ashamed, moved on. But that is a lie. The fire did not die. It smoldered beneath the soil, passed down in whispers, in bloodlines, in rituals never recorded. By the 1830s, descendants of the accused and the accusers still carried that poison. And one young woman, a direct descendant of a condemned witch, began to suffer an illness that no doctor could name, no priest could cleanse, and no historian would dare explain. Her symptoms were strange, shifting like shadows. Some nights she screamed as if hands tightened around her throat. Other times she spoke in forgotten tongues, naming things no girl her age should know, things carved into old Puritan sermons, hidden in the margins. Her body twisted as though something ancient was feeding on her marrow. Yet what terrified her family most was not the illness itself, but the knowledge that it was written into their bloodline. A curse disguised as heritage. You see, Salem was never about witches. It was about control. It was about weaponizing belief to bend the minds of the people. The trials were not a fever. They were a ritual of fear, designed to root itself so deep in New England soil that generations later the fruit of terror would still grow. And by 1830 those roots were blooming again, inside a fragile descendant whose body was turning into a battleground, between memory and possession. Doctors wrote it off as nervous, fits. Ministers muttered about sin, unrepented. But what if the truth was far more sinister? What if the so-called madness of the trials was not hysteria, but a successful experiment in psychological warfare, one so powerful it reached through centuries into the bones of the innocent? This is not just history. This is inheritance, a corruption that flows from ancestor to heir, waiting for its moment to erupt. And tonight, I will show you that what happened to that young woman in the 1830s was not isolated. It was a signal, a reminder that curses do not die when bodies hang. They migrate, adapt, and re-emerge when the world forgets. You were never supposed to hear this. But once you do, there is no going back. Imagine sitting in a candle-lit room in Salem, 1834. The furniture plain, the Bible on the table, the walls whispering with the weight of Puritan ghosts. A young woman, barely 19, sits trembling in a wooden chair, her eyes sunken, her skin pale as wax. She is the last living thread of a family name once branded as witchborn. Her ancestors hanged at Gallows Hill, their graves unmarked, their names blackened, and now their blood screams inside her. The town whispers again, as it once did a century before, not of witches this time, but of madness. A faintly polite word for the inexplicable, an illness without origin, a terror without form. She falls into trances, her lips moving in prayers older than the Puritans, words no villager recognizes. At night, she convulses, limbs jerking in unnatural rhythms, as though marionette strings are pulled by an unseen hand. And every dawn, she wakes more hollow, as if something invisible had been feeding on her while the world slept. But here is the question no one dares ask. Was this simply disease? Or inheritance? Could belief itself become a contagion, passed not only through words, but through blood? Because what the ministers of Salem achieved in 1692 was not just the murder of women, it was the creation of a system, a template. They proved that fear could be injected like venom, and it would replicate itself through generations. They branded children with their parents' shame, made bloodlines into prisons, turned heritage into chains. And once that kind of curse takes hold, no time can kill it. When physicians of the 1830s examined her, they found nothing, no fever, no wound, no corruption of the body. Yet her condition spread like fire. Servants reported nightmares, neighbors saw shadows, her own siblings began to fall ill. The sickness was not inside her lungs or bones, it was inside the story she carried. And this is the truth your history books never tell, that curses are not broken by time, they are fed by it. Like roots tunneling deeper into the earth, they grow unseen, preparing for the day they resurface in the flesh of the living. This girl was not cursed because of what she had done. She was cursed because she carried a name. The sickness did not confine itself to her body. That was the first sign that this was not ordinary. Within weeks, those closest to her, her younger brother, the maid, even the family dog, began showing subtle changes. The brother spoke in his sleep, muttering about gallows and ash. The maid refused to go into the cellar, swearing she heard chains dragging in the dark. Even the dog howled every night at the exact hour her fits began. Do you understand what that means? It means the curse was not a private affliction. It was contagious, not like a plague of the body, but a plague of the mind. The community, steeped in their Protestant sensibilities, whispered of demonic forces, of retribution from God. But the truth was more dangerous than demons. The truth was this: the witch trials were not an accident of paranoia. They were a formula, a ritual engineered by men who understood the psychology of fear. Salem was their experiment. They discovered that if you break one mind publicly, you can fracture an entire town. If you condemn one family, you infect their descendants with inherited shame. That shame becomes the leash, and the leash becomes the system. This girl, let us call her Abigail, was only the latest vessel for a cycle older than she knew. Her body convulsed, not because of unseen spirits clawing at her, but because her lineage had been branded with a symbol. Symbols are chains, and chains, once forged, remain until someone dares to shatter them. When Abigail writhed on the floor, foaming at the mouth, the neighbors crowded outside, whispering that the witches had returned. They wanted her gone, buried, erased, as if removing her would protect them. But here is the paradox. Every attempt to silence her only made the sickness stronger, because the curse was not in her flesh, it was in the silence itself. And this is where you must pay attention. Because you too live inside systems that feed on silence, on inherited guilt, on fear passed down like poisoned wine. What was done to Abigail in Salem's shadow is the same structure that still grips nations, institutions, and families today. The names change. The chains do not. Abigail's illness was not her own. It was ours. A mirror showing us how fear, once institutionalized, becomes eternal. The night it became undeniable, the whole town heard her. The screams tore through the wooden beams of her family's home, carrying across the narrow streets of Salem like the wail of something inhuman. People gathered, clutching lanterns, crossing themselves, muttering prayers. And when the door was opened, what they saw was not the sickness of a frail girl, but the theater of an old curse demanding recognition. Abigail was no longer herself. Her body contorted in positions that defied the bone. Her eyes rolled back, her voice dropping into tones too low for a human throat. But the words were the worst of all. She named names, families, old names tied directly to the original witch trials. The descendants of judges, ministers, informants. She spat them into the air as though she were reciting an ancient ledger of guilt, and each name landed like a brand of fire. The townsfolk froze. For in that moment, they realized what they had tried for over a century to deny, that the witch trials had never ended. They had only gone underground, sleeping in bloodlines, waiting for someone weak enough or strong enough to carry the memory back into the world. Do you see it? The illness was not random. It was targeted. It resurrected history that was meant to stay buried. Her body became the stage for the town's forgotten sins. She was not possessed by devils. She was possessed by memory itself. The kind that institutions bury, because memory is the one thing that can unravel control. And this is where the real manipulation reveals itself. Institutions, whether they wear the robes of the church, the wigs of judges, or the masks of governments, know that memory is power. So they do not destroy the past. They twist it. They rewrite it. They call it hysteria. They call it madness. They call it superstition. All so that when the truth returns, as it did through Abigail, it looks insane, unbelievable, dismissible. But that night, no one could dismiss it. The girl spoke with voices not her own, recounting secret trials never written down, whispering confessions her ancestors screamed before the rope choked them silent. How did she know these things? She didn't. The curse did. The system did. The chain of shame did, and the town, in its fear, would soon make the same mistake their ancestors had made, silence the messenger instead of confronting the truth. After that night, Salem was no longer a quiet town. The echoes of Abigail's voice lingered in every corridor, every church pew, every whisper exchanged between neighbors. The names she spoke had power. They were not random. They were the descendants of the very men who had once sentenced the innocent to die. Judges who built wealth on confiscated land, ministers who profited from fear, informants who saved themselves by condemning others. Their bloodlines were now marked, just as surely as Abigail's had been. And here is the poison of history. When secrets are forced underground, they rot, and the stench eventually seeps back into the air. Abigail's body was simply the vessel that carried it. Her convulsions and screams were less an illness and more a revelation. The curse was never supernatural. It was psychological. It was systemic. It was the weight of hidden guilt pressing down through generations until someone broke. The townspeople, however, did not see it this way. Fear distorts the eye. They began whispering about the families Abigail had named, about how the old blood had carried corruption forward. Resentments, long buried, rose to the surface. Business rivalries turned into accusations. Marriages strained under suspicion. Friendships cracked under the paranoia that maybe, just maybe, the curse was contagious, and this was the brilliance of the original trials. Do you see it? The formula had not died. Divide the people. Infect them with suspicion. Teach them to fear one another more than the power above them. Salem once again was being torn apart, not by witches but by belief. The system was running itself without any magistrate pulling the strings. The curse was the programming, and the people were the obedient machines. Meanwhile, Abigail grew worse. Her body wasted away, but her voice grew sharper, clearer, more commanding. She accused not only names from the past, but acts committed in the present. Secret infidelities, theft, hidden debts. She spoke them in the night, and the villagers listened, shaken. Because whether she was cursed, possessed, or simply mad, her words struck too close to truths they wanted buried. And so the town faced a choice: confront the legacy of their ancestors' corruption, or silence Abigail, as they had silenced the condemned in 1692. History, once again, stood at the gallows. By the spring of 1835, word of Abigail's condition had spread beyond the narrow streets of Salem. Ministers from Boston arrived to observe her. Physicians from Harvard made the journey, armed with notebooks and skepticism. Some came to expose fraud. Others came because they sensed something greater was unfolding, something that could not be confined to a sick girl in a wooden house. What they found shook them. Abigail's condition followed no medical logic. Her pulse would quicken to the point of death, then stabilize in seconds. Her body would stiffen like stone, then collapse into lifelessness before she gasped back into breath. But the most disturbing detail was not the seizures, it was the knowledge. She revealed private sins of the ministers who sat at her bedside. She spoke of buried scandals the doctors thought forgotten. The deeper they examined her, the more they realized the illness was not simply inside her, it was inside them. This is the hidden terror of corruption. It does not die when the guilty are buried. It lingers waiting for a host. Abigail had become the host of Salem's collective sin, and in her voice the system's skeleton was rattling. The ministers called it the devil's trick. The doctors wrote it down as hysteria. But behind their words was fear, the kind of fear only guilty men feel when truth refuses to stay buried. One physician recorded in his journal something that was later destroyed. It is as though the girl carries a memory not her own, a memory that forces the guilty to see themselves in her eyes. This is not disease. This is design. Design. That word was dangerous, because if Abigail's affliction was designed, then someone, some force, some system, wanted it to exist. And perhaps that was the greatest fear of all, that the witch trials of 1692 were never a breakdown of reason, but a successful architecture of control. Abigail was not an accident. She was a symptom, a signal that the experiment was still alive, still functioning, still replicating itself through time. Do you see now? History does not repeat because people are foolish. It repeats because the systems that profit from fear ensure it repeats. Abigail's curse was no curse at all. It was exposure. And that exposure was about to spread like fire beyond Salem's walls. The more Abigail spoke, the more dangerous she became, not because of her fits, but because of what her fits revealed. The ministers wanted her silenced. The physicians wanted her studied. But the common people, the farmers and laborers who had always bent their necks under the weight of Puritan legacy, began to whisper something else entirely. They whispered that Abigail's words were not curses, but truth. That her illness was not madness, but revelation. That maybe the sickness she carried was the sickness of Salem itself. Guilt that belonged not to her, but to the town, to the church, to the descendants of the judges who had spilled innocent blood for power. And so the first cracks of rebellion began to show. Young men stood outside the church after sermons, muttering about how the ministers seemed more afraid of a girl than of the devil himself. Old women crossed themselves when Abigail spoke their family secrets, but instead of denouncing her, they nodded, as if to say, "Finally, the truth is being spoken." The elites felt it. The system always feels it when its grip begins to loosen. Ministers thundered from pulpits, warning that listening to Abigail was tantamount to consorting with demons. Physicians signed papers declaring her insane, hoping to confine her and end the contagion of her words. But the harder they tried to suppress her, the more her voice spread, retold in taverns, whispered in fields, carried on the lips of men who had lived too long under silence. Do you understand the danger here? A curse only has power when people believe it is theirs to bear. Abigail, in her convulsions and revelations, shifted that power. She forced people to see that the curse was not inside her body. It was inside the system that had labeled her family cursed. If that realization spread too far, the architecture of fear that had ruled Salem for over a century could collapse. One night, when Abigail's fits reached their peak, she screamed words that no one in the room forgot. "Your chains are not forged of iron, but of silence." The room fell to its knees, because every man there knew she was right, and so the battle lines were drawn. The people on one side, curious and restless. The institutions on the other, desperate to contain the flame. But history shows us, once a flame begins to spread, there is no institution strong enough to stop it. By midsummer of 1835, Abigail's affliction was no longer Salem's secret. Letters carried her story to Boston, to New York, even to Philadelphia. They told of a girl who named sins buried for generations, a girl whose body convulsed but whose tongue spoke truths sharper than any sermon. And those who read the letters did not dismiss them as madness. They felt something awaken inside, because men know when they are hearing more than gossip. They know when they are hearing forbidden truth. The elites moved quickly. Ministers published pamphlets warning against the contagion of superstition. Doctors circulated essays on the dangers of female hysteria. Newspapers printed carefully edited reports, mocking Abigail as a spectacle, a rural curiosity. Yet behind their laughter was fear, because for every attempt to silence her, her legend grew louder. Farmers in distant towns began to hold gatherings where Abigail's words were recited like scripture. Young men spoke of her as a prophet, not a patient. Even those who had never seen her believed she carried a message meant for them, that corruption, once hidden, can never remain buried forever. The witch trials, long taught as a cautionary tale against hysteria, were now being retold as proof of institutional deception. Do you see the shift? The system had worked for centuries by controlling the narrative, branding victims as witches, heretics, hysterics. But Abigail was breaking that pattern. She was showing people that the sickness had never been inside the accused. It had always been inside the accusers, and here lies the forbidden knowledge. History is not written to record truth. It is written to protect power. The same men who had hanged her ancestors had written the accounts that painted them as guilty. And now their descendants sought to do the same to her, declare her insane, erase her words, bury her body under the label of madness. But something was different this time. The people were beginning to see through it. Abigail had cracked open the illusion, and once you see the illusion, you can never unsee it. Her sickness had become a signal, not just to Salem, but to every man who ever felt the invisible weight of chains forged centuries before his birth. Chains of silence, chains of fear, chains that could only hold as long as men believed they were unbreakable. Abigail was teaching them otherwise. By autumn, Abigail's voice had become something larger than herself. She no longer spoke only in fits, nor only in the fevered hours of the night. At times she sat upright, calm, her gaze steady, her voice measured, and spoke in sentences so sharp they cut through every man in the room. It was as if the madness had burned away, leaving only revelation. She declared that the witch trials were not the shame of Salem, they were the template of America. The system of fear and accusation, of breaking men by branding them cursed, had not ended in 1692. It had been refined, institutionalized, repackaged as law, religion, even science. They no longer call it witchcraft, she said, but the chains are the same. Her words struck like thunder. Men who had dismissed her as delirious now sat in silence, unable to look her in the eyes, because deep inside they knew she was right. They had felt those chains. Chains of guilt for sins not theirs. Chains of silence where speaking truth meant exile. Chains of fear where power ruled not with swords, but with the whispers of shame. And here, my friend, is where you must lean in. Because the same system that tried to crush Abigail has tried to crush you. They don't burn witches anymore. They burn reputations. They burn your will to resist. They burn your inheritance of strength by convincing you that you were born weak, guilty, and powerless. That is the curse of our age, but curses can be broken when men name them for what they are. That is why I want you to do something right now. Go to the comments and write this phrase twice exactly as you see it. Chains of silence are broken. Not once, twice. Because the act of writing it is not for me. It is for you. It is a ritual of defiance, a signal to yourself and to others watching that you are not just a spectator, you are part of this descent into forbidden truth. You are part of the awakening. Do this, and you will feel it, the shift. Because identity is not inherited, it is forged. And in breaking silence you break the curse. Abigail's voice was not just for Salem, it was for every man who refuses to bow. The elites could not allow this to continue. Salem was becoming restless. Farmers who once bowed their heads in church now muttered openly about hypocrisy. Young men carried Abigail's phrases like weapons, whispering them in taverns, carving them into barn doors. Even in Boston, where ministers prided themselves on reason and order, her name carried weight, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. The institutions understood the danger. Not that Abigail was possessed, not that she was sick, but that she was awakening men to see the structure for what it was. A system of control, built on inherited fear. If enough men saw through it, the architecture would collapse. And so the ministers gathered, the physicians convened, and the descendants of the old Salem judges sharpened their knives, not literal, but institutional. They branded her insane. They declared her a danger to herself and others. The physicians prescribed confinement. The ministers called for exorcism. The newspapers painted her as a lunatic whose family had bred only weakness. Every tool of power was aimed at her, not to heal but to erase. Do you see the pattern? It is the same in every age. When an individual speaks truth too clearly, too dangerously, the system does not debate them. It discredits them, first with ridicule, then with medical labels, then, if all else fails, with silence, locked away in institutions where no voice can reach the world. And Abigail, frail in body but burning with something greater, stood at the center of this storm. Her family begged for mercy. Some neighbors defended her, but most fell silent, afraid. Silence is the system's greatest ally. Still, her words lingered. Even as the ministers schemed to confine her, men in taverns repeated her most dangerous line. Your chains are not forged of iron, but of silence. That line became a weapon sharper than any blade, and that terrified the institutions more than any fit, any convulsion, any scream. Because words once believed cannot be unspoken, they prepared their final move. Abigail would not be allowed to continue. The system had decided, She must disappear. But history has shown us something else, something the powerful always forget. When you try to bury fire, you do not extinguish it. You spread it. They came for her at night. That is always how the system works. Quietly, under the cover of darkness, when the fewest eyes are watching. A wagon, a set of iron restraints, and men with no faces in the lamplight. They told the family it was for her own good, that the physicians in Boston would know what to do. But everyone knew what it meant. It meant silence. It meant erasure. Abigail did not resist. Her body was too frail. But as they lifted her into the wagon, she spoke one last phrase to the gathering crowd, her voice sharper than any minister's sermon. "Do not bury me. Bury them." Those words lodged like a thorn in every ear that heard them. The ministers dismissed it as lunacy. The doctors called it delirium. But the people understood. She was not speaking of herself. She was speaking of the system that had condemned her ancestors, that now sought to bury her. In Boston, Abigail was placed in a cold stone building. Not a hospital, not really. It was one of those early asylums where the unwanted were hidden, where the inconvenient were locked away, where truth could be smothered under the label of madness. There she wasted, her voice still rising in the night, her words still cutting, even as her body withered. But here is what the elites did not understand. Removing her from Salem did not remove her influence. It amplified it. Men who had witnessed her fits returned home and repeated her words. Farmers wrote them into journals. Sailors carried them to distant ports. In taverns and meeting houses, her phrases were whispered like passwords. Chains of silence are broken. Do not bury me. Bury them. These became signals, code for those who were beginning to see through the illusion. The system had meant to erase her. Instead, they made her a legend, and this, my friend, is the eternal mistake of power. They believe they can crush truth by confining the body that carries it. But bodies are temporary. Words are not. Once released, words take on a life of their own. They move faster than chains can bind. They infect faster than fear can contain. Abigail, frail and forgotten in a Boston asylum, had already won, because the fire she lit in Salem now burned underground, spreading silently, waiting for its time. And the system, though it had silenced her mouth, could not silence the awakening. In Salem, the ministers congratulated themselves. Abigail was gone, the convulsions silenced, the nightly screams no longer echoing down the crooked streets. To the elites, it was proof of victory, proof that the system still held. But beneath that thin surface of order, something far more dangerous was growing. Her words had taken root. Men began meeting in barns, in candle-lit back rooms of taverns, in the quiet of the fields after work. They gathered not to drink, not to gossip, but to repeat Abigail's phrases like scripture. They spoke of chains of silence, of bloodlines poisoned by corruption, of the need to break what had been handed down like shackles. It began small, 2 or 3 men whispering by lantern light. But soon they were 10, then 20, and always they kept her words alive. Abigail's absence made her more powerful. She had become a myth, a prophet locked away by the system because she had seen too much. And for men who had lived their entire lives under inherited fear, her story was liberation. The ministers tried to counter it with sermons. The physicians published essays mocking her disease. But the more they tried to erase her, the more her legend hardened. Men no longer spoke of her as a frail girl in fits, but as a symbol, proof that the system's chains were not divine, but man-made. Proof that if one descendant of Salem could resist, so could they. This underground current began to bind men together in ways the system feared most. Brotherhood, shared defiance. A recognition that fear itself, not witches, not curses, not the devil, was the true enemy. Once men began to see fear as a tool, the tool lost its edge. Understand this. Power survives only by convincing men that silence is safety. But Abigail's voice had inverted that equation. Silence was no longer safety, it was slavery. And the men who gathered in barns and taverns began to feel something new. The stirrings of identity, not forged by guilt, but by defiance. Abigail had not just revealed a sickness. She had planted a weapon, and that weapon was spreading through the hands of ordinary men who had begun to whisper in unison, "Do not bury me." Bury them. The system had not destroyed her. It had created its worst nightmare, an idea it could not kill. By the winter of 1836, the whisper had become a current, and the current a tide. Salem's taverns, Boston's alleys, even the farmlands stretching into New Hampshire, all carried Abigail's words. Men no longer repeated them as curiosities. They repeated them as vows. The brotherhood was no longer hidden. It was forming, solidifying, taking shape. They were not rebels in the traditional sense. They carried no banners, raised no armies. Their rebellion was quieter, sharper, more insidious to the system. They stopped obeying. They stopped flinching when ministers thundered from the pulpit. They stopped kneeling when officials demanded deference. They stopped passing on the inherited shame of Salem, choosing instead to see it for what it was, a tool of control. And this is what terrified the elites most. They understood that violence can always be crushed with greater violence. But when men withdraw their belief, when they refuse to bend to the architecture of fear, the system collapses under its own weight. That is the power Abigail had given them. Reports began reaching Boston of farmhands refusing to tithe, claiming the church had no authority over their souls. Young apprentices in Salem walked out of sermons, muttering Abigail's phrases under their breath. Even in the asylum, guards whispered that Abigail still spoke at night, her words carrying through the stone halls like embers, sparking fire in those desperate enough to listen. The ministers responded with louder sermons, the physicians with harsher diagnoses, and yet the brotherhood only grew, because every attempt to silence Abigail only confirmed what she had revealed, that the system feared the truth more than it feared the devil himself. One man, a blacksmith from Danvers, is recorded as saying, "If they must lock her away, then I know she spoke the truth. If she were harmless, they would let her speak." That sentiment spread faster than any pamphlet. For men recognized the pattern. The system never wastes effort erasing lies. It only erases dangerous truths. The elites had tried to contain Abigail by removing her body. Instead, they had unleashed her spirit. She had become the living proof that curses are not supernatural, they are manufactured. And once men recognize the hand that forges their chains, they no longer see those chains as unbreakable. The brotherhood was no longer a rumor. It was a force. And the system, trembling, began preparing for war. Fear is always the system's first weapon, and in 1837, the ministers and magistrates of Salem sharpened it to a blade. They began circulating stories of men who had lost their minds after repeating Abigail's phrases. Tales of farmers who withdrew from the church and were struck dead within a week. Whispers of curses, divine punishment, madness spreading like rot through the brotherhood. It was no coincidence. These men were not cursed, they were silenced. The authorities made examples of them, dressing their murders as accidents, their disappearances as divine judgment. And the message was clear: follow Abigail, and you will share her fate. But something unexpected happened. Instead of scaring men back into obedience, the campaign only deepened suspicion. The more the system leaned on fear, the more transparent its games became. The brotherhood began to see the pattern, control built not on truth, but on spectacle. Deaths were staged, madness performed, all to maintain the illusion that disobedience was fatal. In Boston, one tavern keeper told his patrons, "If God struck these men down, why does it look so much like rope burns around their necks?" Men laughed, but beneath the laughter was fire. Mockery was the first step toward immunity, because when fear becomes ridiculous, it loses its power. Still, the cost was blood. Farmers vanished. Apprentices were accidentally crushed in mills. One teacher, known for reading Abigail's words aloud to her students, was found drowned in her own well. These deaths were not random. They were carefully chosen, targeted, symbolic. The system was waging psychological war, and yet the brotherhood adapted. They began to use coded language, turning Abigail's phrases into symbols carved on door frames, scratched into workbenches, whispered in passing. A new lexicon of resistance was born, one that the ministers could not easily detect or suppress. Every mark, Every phrase was both defiance and initiation. The elites had tried to burn fear into the people, but in doing so, they only revealed their desperation. Men began to understand. If the system truly held divine power, it would not need such theatrics. Real power does not beg to be believed. It does not rely on staged corpses or manipulated sermons. And so the Brotherhood whispered the truth more boldly. The curse is not upon us. The curse is the system itself. The war of shadows had begun. And this time fear was no longer one-sided. The elites had always relied on one principle, that fear flows downward. From pulpit to pew, from magistrate to common man, from physician to patient. But in 1838, something shifted. The Brotherhood learned to reverse the current. They learned that fear, once understood, can be wielded against its maker. Men began to turn the system's tools into mirrors. In Salem, ministers woke to find symbols scratched into their doors, marks that echoed Abigail's phrases, marks no one could explain. Physicians found strange words carved into their desks, words that questioned their diagnoses. Whose sickness is it now? Every attempt at intimidation was answered with a darker whisper, a shadow just beyond their reach. The system called it hysteria. But in truth, it was counter-psychology. The Brotherhood understood that the elites thrived on control of perception, not reality. So they began to manipulate perception back. Sermons about divine curses were interrupted by men standing silently in the aisles, their presence alone unsettling enough to unravel the preacher's authority. Magistrates who sentenced Abigail's followers to prison found themselves mocked in taverns, their names becoming jokes, their authority hollowed out from underneath. Even the asylum was infiltrated. Guards carried stories of hearing Abigail's voice where she could not possibly be. Patients spoke words they should not have known, repeating phrases only whispered in barns miles away. Whether these were coincidences or deliberate plants by the Brotherhood hardly mattered. The effect was the same. The institution began to doubt itself. Understand this. The greatest weapon against tyranny is not open war. It is erosion. The Brotherhood did not need to topple the church with fire, nor storm the asylum with force. They only needed to plant enough doubt, enough cracks in the facade, that ordinary men saw through the illusion. Because once men see the trick, the magician's power dies. By the late 1830s, the elites faced a nightmare they could not control. Fear no longer ran in one direction. It ricocheted, circled, turned inward. Ministers feared their congregations. Physicians feared their patients. And in the quiet halls of power, men whispered that Salem was sick again. Not with witches, not with devils, but with an idea that could not be confined. Abigail had planted a seed. The Brotherhood had watered it, and now it was breaking stone. By 1839, Salem was quiet again, but not in the way the ministers had hoped. The silence was different now. It was not submission but watchfulness. The townsfolk listened to sermons, yes, but with cold, unblinking eyes. They obeyed magistrates, but their obedience was hollow. The elites had not restored order. They had destroyed belief. Abigail's name was rarely spoken aloud anymore, but it did not need to be. She had become something larger than memory, an undercurrent, a presence in every whispered doubt, every half-smile exchanged between men when a minister thundered too loudly. She was not a girl in an asylum. She was a force the system could not bind, and this is the truth the system never wanted you to see. Curses are not supernatural. They are manufactured, inherited, and enforced through fear. Salem had never been cursed by witches. It had been cursed by men. Men who discovered that guilt and terror could control generations. Men who built chains out of silence and dared to call them divine. But the chain had broken. Not by rebellion in the streets, not by blood spilled in revolution, but by a far quieter force. Awareness. Once men recognized the curse for what it was, a tool, they were no longer bound by it. The Brotherhood did not need to win openly. They had already won by refusing to kneel. The elites retreated into louder sermons, stricter laws, harsher punishments. But their desperation revealed the truth. Power built on deception cannot last. Power built on fear must constantly feed itself, and when men stop believing in the curse withers. Abigail's body remained in confinement, her illness never cured, her life never freed. But in death she would have the last word, for her story spread beyond Salem, beyond Massachusetts, carried by whispers, journals, and symbols carved where no magistrate could erase them. The sickness she revealed was never hers, it was the system's, and once revealed it could never be hidden again. So understand this, what they called a curse was, in truth, a mirror. The sickness was not in Abigail's bloodline, it was in the bloodline of power itself. And if you have followed me through this descent, you now see the truth the ministers feared most. Salem was not haunted by witches. It was haunted by its own corruption. And that ghost never died, it still walks among us.